The security assessment of the Silvari Commerce Consulate was, by every professional metric Jace Mercer had developed over 12 years of threat assessment work, going well. This was not a given. High-profile consulate security reviews had variables that simpler contracts didn't: the political layering, the access restrictions, the specific difficulty of assessing threats to environments or the people inside them, had reasons to be selective about what they showed the person assessing it. He had run 5 consulate-level reviews in his career, and 2 of them had been straightforward, and 3 had been the specific, sustained professional challenge of building trust with a client who had legitimate reasons for not trusting anyone, and he had learned to tell the difference quickly. Sale Vornitha was the straightforward kind. Not uncomplicated, she was one of the most precise people he had worked with, which created a particular kind of demand on the assessment process. But honest in her requirements and clear about her constraints, and genuinely invested in the outcome of the work, which was a client profile that produced clean results when the consultant reciprocated in kind. He had reciprocated in kind. The work had been clean. 3 weeks in, 17 days of access logs reviewed and physical security audits conducted and communications protocols assessed, and the specific iterative work of building a threat picture from accumulated detail. 17 days of professional mornings and professional afternoons and professional evenings. The relationship between consultant and client maintained at exactly the distance that made the work possible. He was reading an access log audit when the door chimed at midnight. He registered the hour before he registered anything else. The midnight door chime occupied a category in his professional instinct that was separate from day-hour door chimes, populated by emergencies and crises, and the specific threat scenarios his work prepared him to respond to. He was at the door in the time it took to cover the distance from his desk, already running the first response assessment as he opened it. Sale Vornitha stood in the corridor. He ran the emergency assessment in the first 2 seconds and found no threat, no visible injury, no indication of external threat scenario, nothing in her immediate environment that his training flagged as danger. He shifted to a secondary assessment in the next 2 seconds and found something his professional training did not have a clean category for. She was in distress that was not emergency-shaped, but was real in a way that he could read in her bioluminescent patterns even before his cultural briefing supplied the translation. The patterns were unlike anything in the briefing. They were beyond the range the briefing covered, which was information in itself. The briefing had been comprehensive, and what he was looking at had exceeded it. She was standing in the corridor with the posture of someone who had arrived at a door they had been walking toward for some time, and were now committed to what came next. She had the careful stillness of someone who was using stillness as a management strategy. She delivered what she said next in the formal register of someone who had rehearsed exactly these words, because he understood, reading her, that rehearsing them had been the only mechanism available for making them possible to say. My species bonds neurologically through physical contact during emotional vulnerability, she said. I am approaching cascade failure from prolonged isolation. I need you to hold me for approximately 20 minutes, nothing more, or my biology will begin shutting down non-essential systems. He heard the clinical phrasing. He heard it clearly, with the full attention of a security consultant who was very good at his job. And he heard, underneath it, with the full attention of a person who had been in proximity to another person for 3 weeks and had learned the difference between her formal register and her actual one, what the clinical phrasing was covering. Someone asking for touch the way someone asked for emergency intervention, because the emergency was real and the delivery was the only form Pride had left available. He said yes. The decision was operational, basic duty of care, the standard of any professional in proximity to a client in medical distress. And it was also, in the same moment and without contradiction, simply human. He stepped back from the door. She came in. He had a chair at his desk and a chair near the window and the utilitarian sofa that consulate accommodation provided as a standard furnishing. He sat on the sofa because it was the obvious choice, the most neutral choice, the choice that created the most workable geometry for what was being asked. She sat beside him, and he put his arm around her with the careful, deliberate quality of someone establishing the contact that was needed and nothing beyond it. The first thing he noticed was the trembling. It was not dramatic. It was the specific, fine trembling of a system under strain that had been concealing the strain for long enough that the concealment had become its own energy cost, and the contact of another person had given the system permission to stop concealing it. He felt it through the formal fabric of her diplomatic attire, and adjusted his hold without drawing attention to the adjustment. The way you adjusted to conditions that needed managing without making the management visible. She was not someone who would be helped by visible management. She was someone who had come here despite every instinct she had against coming here, and what she needed from him was presence, not performance. He provided presence. The bioluminescent patterns visible at the edges of her collarbones. The ones his cultural briefing had spent 3 pages on, and that he had been reading for 17 days without letting himself think about reading them, were running the distress signatures he had never seen in waking hours, which told him something about how carefully she had been managing them. They were not subtle. They were the patterns of a system that had been rationing a resource for weeks and was now below the threshold where rationing was sustainable. He sat with this information in the way he sat with operational information, noting it, filing it, not making it into something larger than it was while also not pretending it was smaller. The 20 minutes were what they were, a biological intervention, clinically requested, professionally provided. The weight of them was also what it was, which was the weight of sitting in close contact with another person. At the exact point, they had stopped being able to maintain their own exterior. And he was not going to be dishonest about that weight by categorizing it out of existence. She did not speak. He did not speak. The room had its familiar ambient sound, the climate system, the distant station noise, the quality of a space that was being occupied in a way it had not been occupied before, and they sat in it with the specific silence of 2 people who had arrived somewhere that words would have diminished, and who both understood this without discussion. The trembling subsided in stages. It was not linear. There were moments where it seemed to resolve and then returned, the system recalibrating unevenly, and he tracked it the way he tracked all things that required monitoring without drawing attention to the monitoring. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted across the 20 minutes in the visible, incremental way of something moving from distress towards something more stable, and he watched the shift in his peripheral vision without making it into the focus of his attention, because the focus of his attention needed to be available for her to not be looked at. When the 20 minutes had passed, she straightened. The movement was deliberate, the specific deliberateness of someone returning to themselves after a necessary absence from the management they normally maintained. The formal posture came back. The patterns had not fully stabilized. They were calmer, the crisis register replaced by something lower and more sustainable, but they were no longer what they had been when she arrived. "Thank you," she said, in the formal register. It was the only register she had available at the moment, and he understood that. "Are you stable?" he said. "Yes," she said. "The cascade has interrupted." "Good," he said. She stood. She straightened in the specific way that was, he now understood, her deliberate reconstruction of the composed exterior she maintained during waking hours. The visible layers settling back into position with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this reconstruction their entire professional life. "I apologize for the hour," she said. "You don't need to," he said. She looked at him for a moment across the small space of the room, with the expression of a person who had something else to say and was determining whether to say it here or at another time. She determined another time. "Good night, Mercer," she said. "Good night," he said. The door closed. He stood in the room that the 20 minutes had made, in the specific silence of a space that had contained something and was now empty of it, and he understood something that no professional briefing had prepared him for. That there was a form of intimacy that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with witness, and that he was now, irrevocably, in possession of it. He knew how she felt when she stopped maintaining. He had been there when she stopped maintaining. He had felt the trembling that she spent every waking hour making invisible. He could not unknow any of it. He had no mechanism for unknowing it. He filed it in the category of things that would require him to figure out what to do with them, and went back to the access log audit he had been reading an hour ago, and did not read a single word of it for the rest of the night. The morning briefing was at 8, as it always was. She was at the briefing table at 7:55, with the threat assessment notes from the previous day's review and the agenda for the morning's work, in the composed and precise and formally competent way that she had been at every morning briefing for 17 days. She was wearing a different diplomatic attire than she had worn in the corridor at midnight. The bioluminescent patterns at her collarbones were the neutral baseline he had read in his cultural briefing, and spent 17 days observing across the distance of professional calibration. He was at the table at 8 with the current access log findings and the morning's assessment priorities. He reviewed the threat picture with the thoroughness he brought to all reviews. She engaged with the findings with the clarity she brought to all briefings. They worked through the morning's agenda in the professional, effective way of two people who were good at their respective functions, and whose functions complemented each other cleanly. Everything was exactly as it had been. He was too experienced in operational environments to pretend he couldn't feel where it was different. It was different in the quality of attention she brought to the moments between agenda items. The small, unstructured intervals that professional settings produced, which had been occupied before by the comfortable efficiency of two people managing shared work, and were now occupied by a different quality of awareness on both sides. He could feel her reading him the way he was reading her, both of them using the professional interaction as a surface under which the other conversation was running, neither of them surfacing it, both of them knowing it was there. He noticed that she had repositioned herself at the table, not dramatically, by approximately 8 inches toward the operational neutral rather than the close-quarter professional distance she had established in the first week. The repositioning was not avoidance. It was management. She was managing the distance the way she managed everything, deliberately, precisely, with the efficiency of someone who knew the exact position required and had placed herself in it. He noted this and did not note it aloud, and adjusted his own positioning by approximately the same amount in the complementary direction, which was the honest response to a managed distance, and which she noticed, because she noticed everything, and which neither of them mentioned. The morning's work concluded at 11. She thanked him for the briefing in the formal register. He confirmed the afternoon's agenda in the professional register. They separated with the practiced smoothness of two people who had been doing this for 3 weeks and had it down. He went back to his quarters and reread the cultural briefing section on Solvari bioluminescent communication for the 3rd time since midnight. The briefing was thorough. It covered baseline patterns, stress patterns, and the formal diplomatic register, the public patterns that a Solvari official maintained in professional settings. It covered, in a 3-paragraph section he had read once when he arrived, and was now reading with the focused attention of someone who needed specific information, the phenomenon of cascade failure, the physiological deterioration that extended social isolation produced in Solvari biology, the neurological bonding requirement that the broader galactic community had. The briefing noted with the diplomatic precision of a document written by someone who understood that all species had vulnerable biology, and that some were more guarded about it than others, categorized variably across cultural contexts, with Solvari individuals tending toward privacy regarding their bonding physiology, owing to historical cultural pressures that defined independence from social bonding necessity, as a marker of sophisticated development. He read that paragraph twice. He thought about the midnight corridor. He thought about a person who had rehearsed the exact words because rehearsing them was the only mechanism available. He thought about the specific, indelible quality of a pride system operating at its limit, the clinical phrasing that was not clinical, the formal register wrapped around a request that had no formal version, the person who had come to his door when her biology had made not coming impossible, and who had made the ask in the most contained form available to her because she was, he understood, the kind of person who would maintain the container until there was no container left. He looked at the window for a while. Then he went back to the access log audit. He had 17 days of work left in, and spent the afternoon doing it with the thoroughness that kept his mind occupied and produced, as a secondary result, excellent security documentation. The consulate assessment was in its final week when the small operational detail happened. He had identified an access vulnerability in the consulate's secondary communication corridor, a gap in the physical monitoring coverage that his assessment had been tracking for 2 days, and that he was ready to present as a formal finding. He brought it to the afternoon briefing in the standard format: diagram, risk assessment, recommended remediation, timeline. She reviewed it with the standard thoroughness. She asked the standard clarifying questions. Then she asked a question that was technically within the operational frame, and was also, in the specific way of questions that carried more than their stated content, not only about the operational frame. In your assessment, she said, is this a vulnerability that was created intentionally as a designed gap for specific access or an oversight? He looked at the diagram. He had spent 2 days with this question and had an answer. Oversight, he said. The coverage gap is in a location that would have been a low-priority installation detail during the original build. Someone moved on before it was finished, and the finish didn't get documented. She looked at the diagram with the focused quality of someone who was thinking about more than one thing at once. The things that are left unfinished, she said, because someone moved on before they were completed. The sentence was accurate about the coverage gap. He heard the full sentence. Yes, he said. She looked at him then, directly, with the assessment quality he had been reading for 20 days and something beneath it that was not the assessment quality. She did not say anything else about the coverage gap. She moved to the next agenda item with the smooth professional efficiency she brought to all transitions. He documented the finding that evening and wrote the remediation recommendation in the specific, unhurried language of a consultant who was doing his work correctly, and was also, in the same hours, doing the less official work of understanding what was happening and what he was going to do with the understanding. He had spent 21 days maintaining professional calibration. He had maintained it correctly. He had no complaint about the calibration and no argument with its necessity. He also understood, with the clarity of someone who had been a careful observer of environments for 12 years, that the calibration was now operating around something that the calibration had not been designed to account for, and that the professional form was going to hold until the contract ended and not a day longer, because professional form was a structure, and structures were not the same as resolutions. 4 days remained in the contract. He did not spend them in the gap between the professional form and the thing it was now containing. He spent them doing the work, the acts. She came to him on the morning of the last day. Not at midnight, not in crisis. At 7 in the morning, which was 1 hour before the final briefing, in the plain and early light that the consulate's environmental systems produced at that hour, while the station outside was running its own ordinary morning. She knocked rather than chiming, which was different, and he understood the difference before he opened the door. She was in her diplomatic attire. She was composed in the way she was always composed, the exterior that she had rebuilt every morning for 25 days with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. And she was also looking at him with the expression of someone who had made a decision, and was going to deliver it without the rehearsed clinical framing she had used the first time, because she had decided that the honest version was the only one worth giving. "I need to say something to you before the contract ends," she said. "Not as a client to a consultant, if you're willing." "Yes," he said, "come in." She came in. She did not sit on the sofa. She stood in the approximate center of the room with the specific quality of a person who has determined the position that lets them say a difficult thing without the position becoming part of the difficulty. And she said what she had come to say. She told him what the midnight request had cost her to make. Not the biology, she had covered the biology that night, in the rehearsed clinical language that was the only form available to her then. She told him the rest. The pride cost, the trust cost, the specific and devastating vulnerability of letting someone see the thing her species considered a failure of development, the need that her independence was built to make invisible. She told him that she had come to his door at midnight because her biology had removed the option of not coming, and that in the 4 weeks before that night, she had been managing the isolation with every resource available to her because she did not want to reach the point of asking. She had reached the point anyway. She told him what it had meant, the yes without hesitation. The 20 minutes that were exactly what she had asked for, and nothing beyond it and nothing less. The specific quality of being held through a crisis by someone who did not make the crisis into something she would need to manage, which was, she said, not a small thing, and she was not going to pretend it was a small thing. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not produce the professional response to a client delivering a significant personal disclosure, because she was not delivering it as a client, and the professional response would have been a form of dishonesty. When she finished, he told her what he knew. He told her that he had been maintaining professional calibration for 4 weeks around something the calibration had not been designed to account for. That the 20 minutes had not left him the same consultant he had been before them. Not in any way that compromised the work, which he was confident about, but in ways that had to do with what you were after you had been the person someone trusted with the specific and indelible reality of their most managed vulnerability. That he had reread the cultural briefing on Solvari bonding physiology 3 times since midnight because he was, by nature and by training, someone who needed to understand what he was in proximity to. He told her that the contract ending in 4 hours was a structure, and that structures were not the same as resolutions, and that what he would like, if she was willing, and if the client-consultant framework ending with the contract created room for what existed outside it, was the time to find out what was actually between them when the professional form was no longer the only thing organizing it. She looked at him. The bioluminescent patterns he had been reading for 25 days were running something he had not seen in the briefing and had not seen in the 25 days, and was not going to pretend he could fully translate. But the translation he had, imperfect as it was, ran in the direction of a person who had decided something and was watching the decision confirmed. "The contract ends at 8, she said. 4 hours, he said. "I don't have a subsequent engagement until 11, she said. "Neither do I," he said. She looked at him with the specific quality of someone who has been precise about things for their entire professional life, and is being precise now about something that is not professional, which required a different kind of precision, and was, he thought, very like her. "Then we have 3 hours after the briefing," she said, "which is enough time to begin finding out." "Yes," he said, "it is." The morning light held them both in the ordinary way of light that had no opinion about what was happening in it, and the consulate ran its routine around them, and the final briefing was in an hour, and the contract would conclude, and the professional structure that had organized the previous 25 days would end in the specific and necessary way of structures that had served their purpose. On the other side of it, neither of them knew exactly what was there. They had 4 weeks of professional proximity and 1 midnight threshold, and the specific, accumulated weight of 2 people who had been paying careful attention to each other across a maintained distance, and were now, with the distance no longer required, in possession of everything they had been paying attention to. It was enough to begin. Both of them understood this. Both of them, without saying so, understood that beginning was what the morning was for, the honest, unhurried, specific beginning of two people who had crossed a threshold without meaning to and had decided, with full information and in the plain light of morning, to find out where it led.